Okay, so welcome again, everybody, to the session. Bill, if you wouldn't mind, advance the slide. My pleasure to introduce Bill Duncan. Bill is president of Project Management Partners. He is director of certification for IPMA-USA, as well as the primary author of the original PMBOK guide. Bill is actually on this webinar. He's coming back to today from tomorrow. Bill is in Malaysia right now and is where it is roughly 3 a.m. tomorrow, Thursday. So hopefully you'll give us a glimpse into the future here, Bill. So without further ado, everyone, I want to give a warm welcome to Bill Duncan.
Thanks, Tim. Let me start with a quick overview of the presentation. I want to talk, basically what I want to do is set the stage for a discussion of complexity, and I want to put it in the context of how we do certification at IPMA-USA. So I'm going to talk just very briefly about the differences, a couple of different kinds of certification, advanced versus entry level. Then I'll talk about role-specific versus generic certifications. Then a quick overview of how we do certification at IPMA. Review of different kinds of complexity, because there are several factors that go into it. And then I want to share with you just a little bit about how we're doing it now, and then how we will be doing it in the future, the system that we set up for rating complexity. Let's start with the difference between advanced and entry level. What I'm showing on this slide is the 4 levels of the IPMA system, A, B, C, and D, as you can see there. And this was designed to follow the career path of someone who was interested in project management. So if you start at the entry-level certification at the bottom, Certified Project Management Associate, that's a knowledge-based certification driven by an exam. In our case, our exam is a combination of multiple choice questions and short essay questions. Then the upper levels, A, B, and C, we call advanced certifications, and they all require a certain amount of experience as a project manager or senior project manager. In addition to the experience requirement, there's then also an interview where previously certified project managers check the understanding of the candidate. The second category there was role-specific versus generic. What I've laid out on this slide is what we call domains in our system now, expanding. We had dealt with program and portfolio managers at level A in the past, but we've now recognized that that's a separate category and split it out. And we've also added certifications at level B for both the program domain and the portfolio domain. So when someone is certified in our system, they are assessed against what's called a profile, which is a combination of the project domain and the level. In terms of the system itself, we call this the road to certification. Relatively straightforward. There's application processing. For the advanced levels, we have a preliminary application which allows us to kind of test the applicant's information and make sure that they do in fact have the experience that is necessary to be considered for the level that they are applying for. The second step is a report and/or an exam. Level B does not currently have an exam. We will be adding that later this year. Level C has an exam. Both of those exams are targeted at issues that would be related to that level. So at level B, for example, a senior project manager would be being asked questions that are appropriate for a senior project manager, and a senior program manager would be being asked questions relevant to the kind of work that they do. When we get to that's true for the report, for the exam, will also be true for the interview at step 3. The advanced levels, A, B, and C, also require a narrative report where the candidate describes a project, program, or portfolio that they have managed. This provides background for the interviewers when we get to the third stage. Now, the assessment is also based on evidence. We've got two major categories of evidence. The first we call testimonial evidence, and that's just what it sounds like. It's testimony from the candidate about what they did in their project, program, or portfolio. And we ask the questions to make sure that they do understand what was done. As an example, I interviewed one candidate. I asked him how his list of stakeholders had been developed, and he said he had no idea he had been given the list by his sponsor. So there's an indication where someone was doing something that in many ways was right, but they were doing it without understanding, which would indicate that they would be unlikely to be able to duplicate it on a future project. We also look at documentary evidence. So as opposed to just having someone say, yes, we've prepared a list of stakeholders, we want to be able to see that list of stakeholders, understand how it was developed, and so on. Now, why are we interested in complexity in this process? I think if you read the statement on this slide here, there shouldn't be anything that comes as a surprise. Some projects, some programs, some portfolios are simply harder to manage than others. It might be because of difficulties with people, difficulties in technology, or whatever. But what we do is we use the complexity measures to determine what projects, programs, and portfolios qualify for levels A, B, and C. Now, currently, we've got 4 major categories, 24 detail factors for programs, 21 for projects. And if you go to the IPMA-USA website and you look under evaluating project management complexity, you can see those categories. You can evaluate your own project. We will eventually take the new approach from IPMA and adapt it, have it available on the website so you can test yourself out ahead of time. But the IPMA approach has 10 major indicators and then a considerably larger number of sub-indicators, which don't necessarily have to be rated independently, but give guidance to the assessors about the things that they're supposed to look at. I'm going to give you examples of each of these in just a second. Now, if we look at complexity, it's not just one dimension. There are a variety of things. If I start with this chart in the upper left-hand corner of technical challenge, that's all that some people think of when they consider complexity. Is this project technically challenging? Are we dealing with recombinant DNA technology? Or are we talking about building a single-family home? Going around clockwise, complexity also includes emergent characteristics. The way I like to think of this is when the ground is changing under you, when you really have no idea what's going to happen next. You start off in one direction, and you may discover it's the wrong direction and have to modify your approach, might even need to modify your team. Continuing, we go to lack of support. I'm sure that there are more than a few of you that at some point have had to deal with this. If management is not supporting the project manager or program manager, it clearly makes their job more difficult, more complex. Just a little sidelight here. There was a survey done a few years ago of project managers in the pharmaceutical industry. The number one problem that they indicated was lack of management support for their efforts. Interestingly enough, however, the second biggest problem that they identified was too much management involvement in their efforts. So it sounded to me like they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. Continuing down to the fourth dimension, variability in approaches. We're not just talking here about differences in how the project is conducted, but we're also looking at differences in the perspectives of the individuals who are involved. For example, if you're working on the design phase of a construction project, you may have mostly engineers speaking to engineers. But if the facility that you're planning is one that's going to be built for a biotech firm, at some point you're going to have some research scientists and maybe a few physician MDs who are part of the discussions as well. And the language, the perspective, the thought process of engineers versus medical professionals may be completely different. And then bringing the circle fully around, we just have basic uncertainty. If there are things that you don't know about on the project, or the program or the portfolio, just any kind of surprise. So what we've done is we've tried to analyze all of these. We've looked at several different models of complexity, both public and private. There are a couple of organizations that do a lot of work with IPMA and certification, and we've looked at their internal models. There's also a model in the UK called DECA, D-E-C-A, and some of you may be familiar with the Complex Project Management Association. We've looked at their model as well. So we took all that information, reviewing both published and proprietary models, and tried to identify both indicators and sub-indicators. In other words, what are the things that generate complexity? And again, I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute. We somewhat arbitrarily decided on a 4-point scale, so very low to very high. 1 point for very low, 4 points for very high. And basically, the higher complexity project gets a higher rating. Then in order to validate or verify what we've done, we're testing those on a regular basis against actual projects, programs, and portfolios, saying, for example, we think this program needs a program director, and having made that assumption or having made that choice, seeing if the tool does in fact reinforce that notion. Does the tool produce a rating that says we need a program director on that particular program? Here are the 10 complexity indicators that we've developed. For those of you who are familiar with the ICB-4 that Tim reviewed a couple of months ago, you'll see that I've highlighted the 3 dimensions of ICB-4 there as well. The practice competences, perspective competences, and personal competences. Basically what we've done with the complexity is we said, okay, these are the things that generate complexity. You look at the first one on the list, various characteristics of objectives. Are they vague? Are they challenging? Or are they in conflict? And we've tried to tie that to the competence baseline by saying, okay, the practice elements are the things that you would most likely use to help address these kinds of complexity indicators. And then the same for the perspective indicators and the same for the personal ones. Here are just two examples of the full descriptions from our material on oops, sorry about that. These are 2 examples. So objectives, we call output-related complexity, and you can see the words there. The complexity originating from vague, exacting, or conflicting goals, objectives, requirements, or expectations. And then I'll give you a couple of examples of sub-indicators as well. And then this is the full description for item 2 as well. We've got complete descriptions for all 10, of course. Now, coincidentally, IPMA calls its system the 4LC, so we've got 4 levels of complexity. On the left-hand side, you see the point scores. Basically, there's a maximum of 40 points with 10 factors, and an absolute minimum of 10 points. So what we consider to be low complexity is below 16 points, moderate is 16 to 25, and so on. And then if you move over to the right of the chart, at the top we've got the director roles from the slide that I showed you earlier. So project director, portfolio director, or program director. And then moving down the list at senior manager, we have project, program, and portfolio senior managers as well. At level C, moderate complexity, we have just project manager. And then we have the Certified Project Management Associate at level D, who might possibly be managing a project, but if they were managing one of very low complexity, we're basically saying that they may be getting help, or they may be applying their technical skills rather than their management skills. So we would not assess competence in a project that had the level of complexity that was that low. What I'd like to do next is review with you 3 sample projects with different complexity profiles to illustrate how the process works. So the 3 projects are an employee orientation program being developed for a government agency, phase 2 clinical trials for a new drug, and then finally implementing an ERP enterprise resource planning application across multiple business units. What I've done is I've taken 5 of the sub-indicators from 5 different main indicators. I did this just to try and make sure it fit on the slide, make it easier for everybody to read and see. So what you see is here from the first one, the very first complexity factor that we reviewed earlier. Here we've got benefits, requirements, expectations, and we've got guidance for the assessors and for the individual candidates as well on how to score the complexity. So if you look at the text next under very low, you'll see that if benefits, requirements, and expectations have been basically the same throughout the project, little in the way of conflict and so on, that particular project would score a 1 on that particular item. Do you have availability of qualified staff? I know there's more than a few people who are always complaining that they've got projects and they don't have people to work on it. So the descriptions here are perhaps a little bit less explicit, but we're saying if you do have quality staff, most of the time, if it's mostly assured, that basically means your project is a little bit less complex to manage. Then we have the difference between the different kinds of risks. If you're familiar with Glenn Allman's writings on epistemic versus aleatory risks, we're basically talking about things that we either know or don't know, things that have known probability distributions. And basically what we're saying is the percentage goes up, that project becomes just that much more complex to manage. The fourth one there is the project manager's or program portfolio manager's relationship with the stakeholders, and we've described that as ranging from warm through cordial and cool to strained. Clearly, if your relationship with your stakeholders is strained, that's going to make life more difficult. Then we have the experience of the team that's supporting you. Have they been in that current role for 5 years or more? Obviously makes your job easier as the project manager if the team that's supporting you has a good deal of experience. All right, let's look at the employee orientation program. What I've done is I've highlighted here in sort of the pale orange how I would rate this project. Typically what we find is that there may be some slight difference in raters. Some may rate a particular sub-indicator a little bit higher, others might rate it a little bit lower, but very seldom is the difference more than a point, and the overall score is almost always within 2 or 3 points, so that gives us a degree of confidence that ratings are accurate. So if we're looking here on the employee orientation program, the benefits, the requirements for that project, the expectations, the same throughout, not changing very much. Everybody knows what they're looking for. Availability of qualified staff. In this case, we've got an HR department that's going to be putting it together. They may get some outside help if they need it, but we know there are lots of contractors who provide these kinds of services. So again, we're saying it's mostly assured. Most of their risks are things with predictable distributions, so we don't have a whole lot of real unknowns there. The relationship with the stakeholders, cordial, generally pretty good, and the management team is reasonably experienced. So what you're seeing here is most of the scores on this project are going to tend to be very low or low. If we move into the phase 2 clinical trials, what we can see is that the ratings are starting to move up the scale. We still have very low in terms of the variability or challenge with benefits, requirements, and expectations. But we start to have some issues with staff. We start to have more epistemic risks. We still have a cordial relationship with our stakeholders, but our management team is somewhat less experienced, increases the complexity, increases the challenge. The third project was implementing an ERP system, and here you see that the ratings are much higher. If I jump down to the bottom here with the relationship with the stakeholders, this shows that the relationship was maybe strained at the beginning, certainly strained over the course of the project. Fairly common circumstance with a lot of ERP systems, so not a surprise that you might see that there. On the first three, you also see that they've shifted up to the right to higher ratings. Some are the same, benefits, requirements, expectations, probably changing quite frequently during the project. Availability of quality staff, we have some folks that are occasionally assured, but not all the time. Our risk profile is changing, and the years in the role for the management team is the same as it was on the previous project. If you'd like further information, you can get a look at the complexity factors that we're using at present. That's the link on the IPMA-USA website there. You can also look at what level you qualify for by looking at the requirements for certification on the website there. And if for any reason your questions don't get answered today, or if you don't think of them until later, we have an email address, cert-operations@ipma-usa.org, and you will usually get an answer within 24 hours, probably never more than 48. Okay, so, whoops. Basically, any questions?
Hi. Thanks. While we're getting a couple questions in the queue, if I may ask, Bill, this is Tim.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit more about kind of the role of risk in your complexity model? Talk a little bit about how that was determined and sort of how you factor the level of risk in and yeah.
That's a little bit challenging because if you think about it, in a way, complexity itself is a risk. And if we go back, excuse me just a second, whoops. Sorry. Okay, if you look at the complexity indicators, in a way, all of those represent risks to the project. The example that I gave you on risk was just one of the sub-indicators from the last item under the practice complexity. So that was the risk profile of the project. So we're not looking at specific risks. Mm-hmm. We're not necessarily we're not looking at specific risks. We're saying what's the risk profile for the project, program, or portfolio.
Okay, so
is it generally?
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Oh, does it generally have many risks that we'll have? If you look at some of the other sub-indicators for the risk profile, are there risks identified where we generally know what the responses are? If so, that's going to lower the complexity. Are there risks where we don't know what the responses are? That increases the complexity. If the risks are areas of uncertainty where we have less knowledge, that increases the complexity as well.
Right.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So kind of a follow-on to that then from Stacy. Why why would entry-level certifications be interested in complexity? How does the model sort of play into a level D certification?
Well, I think most of the way the model plays in, it says let me take a half step back. If you're applying for level D, there is no requirement that you have any project management experience at all. In other words, anybody walking down the street can step in and apply for level D, and if they want to study and if they can pass the test, they can be awarded level D based upon their knowledge of project management. The place where complexity really comes into play is with some junior project managers who have been managing very simple projects, and they've been surviving based upon their technical ability rather than upon their project management skills. So there might be somebody who has the title and maybe even a part-time role as project manager, but if their projects are simple and straightforward enough, then they wouldn't qualify for anything but level D. The project has to be at moderate complexity, at least, to qualify for level C. If you look at some of our competitors, for example, that say they want experience leading or directing projects, but there's nothing identified as to how complex that project needs to be. So there are some people who might qualify for other project management certifications that would only qualify for level D in the IPMA system.
Great. So building on that theme, let me ask about how this model differentiates IPMA from other types of certifications out there. Why is this something that somebody should be interested in looking at?
You're asking marketing questions, and you should know that I stink at marketing. Let me bounce back to, well, actually, I do not know why it's doing this to me. I don't know if you guys can see me going through the slides here, but
yeah, we can.
Okay, let's come back and look at what, my cute little graphic here that I call the road to certification. I think there's a couple of things. If you look at the application processing step, we do in fact verify 100% of a candidate, 100% of the experience of 100% of the candidates. So I think that's something that sets us apart from some of the certification mills that are mostly interested in, or that appear to be more interested in generating revenue from the certification. Our preliminary application, for example, is intended to make sure that we don't waste an applicant's time or money when they apply for, or by having them apply for a certification level that they're not qualified for. So we put some effort into it. We see this as a service rather than just a source of revenue. Second thing that I think sets us apart from any of the other certifications that I've seen is a requirement for a report at the advanced levels. Certainly communication is an important skill for any project manager, any program manager or portfolio manager as well. So you need to be able to communicate to someone else what you did, how you managed the project or program, for example. And then, of course, the final step there is the interview. You are being assessed much like a job interview. We're not trying to make people fail, but we want to make sure that somebody didn't or wasn't able to show documentary evidence without really understanding what they were doing. Very simple example for a very simple tool. I was asked by a client to audit a training program that they were considering bringing in-house. And the instructor for that training program was teaching people how to prepare a Gantt chart without ever having discussed where the activities came from, without communicating to the students that they should be defining precedences or defining sequences and calculating critical path before they start to put together the Gantt chart, so that the Gantt chart would have a basis in reality. And essentially, that's what the interview is all about. Can you, in fact, demonstrate to us, not that just that you prepared the documents, not just that you did the work, but also that you understood what you were doing, you knew the reasons why you were doing it, and very often some of the interview questions will be, what kinds of options did you consider to see if the project manager has a depth of knowledge, has a depth of experience that would be appropriate, for example, for the higher levels at B and C. Okay. Answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Another question.
Sure.
Another question from Tikajit Rai. I hope I got your name right. The 10 complexity indicators, are they the products of IPMA-USA, or are they derived from industry's leading PM organizations?
They are the products of IPMA, of the parent organization. They came out of what we call our internal certification regulations. So they were developed by a team of I guess a core team of about 20 or 25 people from around the world, reviewed by representatives from all 60 plus IPMA organizations. So it's not something that we just came up with, three of us sitting around a room. There was quite a bit of work that went into identifying those 10 factors. And then for those 10 indicators, and then for the sub-indicators, we reviewed all of the literature that we could find. So I mentioned DECA, I mentioned the ICCPM folks. There are also a couple of other organizations that have complexity factors or indicators that are published various places around the web. We looked at everything we could find to try and make sure there wasn't anything we had missed.
Great. Thank you.
Does that answer the question? How come you're seeing these questions and I'm not?
Because I'm the organizer. Okay. Terrific. Thanks. Really appreciate it. And I really appreciate all the questions from everybody. I don't see any more. So what I'd like to do, Bill, if you wouldn't mind, is just advance down to the last couple of slides there.
Yep.
I want to thank everybody for taking the time out. We try to keep these, somewhat abbreviated so that you can get on with your day. Just right on this slide here, if you wouldn't mind. So please take note of the email address for questions about certification, as well as these other websites. And if you just go to IPMA-USA.org, you will see all sorts of information.
That's on the last slide.
Thanks. Okay. So please also visit products.ipma.world, everybody. We've got the ICB, the PEB, and the Organizational Competence Baseline, the OCB. All three are up and are available for free download for everyone. And coming soon, in the next week or two, you will see a web store where you'll actually be able to order those books in hard copy format. So that's coming very soon, everyone. And finally, May 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, we are going to have yet another one of these sessions for Sustainable Development Goals, featuring Joel Carboni. He's the president of IPMA-USA, as well as the president of Green Project Management. Many of you know him. He is a big supporter of IPMA and of sustainability, and he is a real expert in this area. So I would really encourage everyone to register today at IPMA.USA.org for that webinar, May 18th, 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So with that, I want to thank you, Bill Duncan, for a great look at complexity and certification. And I bid you a good night's sleep after this, whatever's left of your night. And thanks, everybody, for showing up. And we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.